You don't expect a normal Tuesday morning to turn into a lesson you'll carry for the rest of your life. But that's exactly what happened to me. I was standing outside my classroom, sipping on a coffee that had gone cold too fast, when I heard the laughter. It wasn't the light-hearted kind. It was sharp, mean, the kind that made your stomach twist before you even knew why. Then came the words. "Hey, you hiding bombs under there, Aisha?" I turned my head. A group of boys, football jackets, cocky grins, had surrounded Aisha Malik near her locker. She stood there, gripping her books, her face tight with something I knew wasn't fear. It was worse than that. It was the look of someone who had heard this before. Someone who was tired. One of the boys reached toward her hijab, and that's when I moved. "Jason." My voice came out sharper than I intended, cutting through the hallway noise. The boys froze. Jason Carter, a linebacker with a family name that carried weight in this town, turned toward me, his grin slipping just a little. "Mr. Thompson," he said, dragging out the syllables like he was amused. "What's going on here?" I asked, keeping my voice even. Jason shrugged, shoving his hands into his pockets like he had all the time in the world. "Just asking Aisha a question." I looked at Aisha. "You okay?" Her eyes met mine, dark and steady. "I'm fine." But she wasn't. I could see it in the way she held herself, in the way her fingers tightened around her books. She was used to this. Used to being the target. "Jason," I said, turning back to him, "how about you and your friends head to class before the bell rings?" For a second, he hesitated. There was something in his expression, contempt, maybe, a flicker of challenge. But he didn't push it. He nodded, muttered something under his breath, and walked off, the other boys following behind. I let out a breath, then turned back to Aisha. "If this happens again, you tell me, okay?" She nodded, but I could tell she didn't believe anything would change. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was just another teacher who would notice for a second and then move on, because that's what usually happened. But as I watched her walk away, something in me twisted. I wasn't going to let this slide. I just didn't know what it would cost me. The trouble started the next morning. I walked into the teacher's lounge, nodding to a few colleagues as I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee. The air was thick with the usual small talk, grades, upcoming tests, weekend plans, until I heard my name. "You hear about Thompson?" a voice muttered. I glanced up. Mrs. Reynolds, who had been teaching history at Lincoln High longer than I'd been alive, was shaking her head over her breakfast burrito. Across from her, Coach Daniels leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Heard he's sticking his nose where it doesn't belong," Daniels said. "Some of these kids just ain't gonna fit in, and that's not our problem." I felt my jaw tighten. "You could say that to my face, you know," I said, stepping toward them. Reynolds looked startled, but Daniels just gave me a slow smirk. "Didn't know you were listening." "I wasn't planning to," I said, setting my coffee down harder than I meant to. "But now that I am, what exactly am I sticking my nose into?" Daniels shrugged. "Just saying, you've been here, what, 7 years? You know how this town is. You make a big deal out of one kid wearing a headscarf, and people are gonna start talking." "They already are," Reynolds added, stirring her coffee. "Jason Carter's parents called the school this morning. Said you embarrassed their boy for no reason." I felt a slow burn rise in my chest. No reason. He was harassing a girl in the hallway. Daniels sighed like I was the one being unreasonable. "Come on, Thompson. Kids mess around." He didn't mean anything by it. He tried to grab her hijab. Reynolds set her spoon down. "Look, we're not saying what he did was right," she said, her voice careful. "But you've got to pick your battles. Some of these families," she hesitated, "they don't see things the way you do." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Pick my battles. Aisha had been standing there, outnumbered, with nowhere to go. She was a kid. And they wanted me to look the other way because Jason Carter's dad was someone important in town? I shook my head. "I did what any decent teacher should do," I said, grabbing my coffee. "If that's a problem, then maybe that's the real issue." I turned and walked out before I said something I'd regret. By lunchtime, I realized just how fast word traveled in this town. I was halfway through my sandwich when my phone buzzed with an email from Principal Holloway. "We need to talk. Stop by my office after school." I had a bad feeling in my gut, but I forced myself to push it aside. I wasn't going to let this go. Not yet. I knocked on Principal Holloway's office door right after the last bell rang. "Come in," he called, his voice tight. I stepped inside and found him leaning back in his chair, arms crossed. He was a thick-built man in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of presence that told you he'd spent years dealing with difficult conversations. He didn't ask me to sit. Not a good sign. "You know why you're here?" he asked. I kept my expression neutral. "I have a guess." He exhaled through his nose. "Jason Carter's parents came in this morning. They're not happy." I crossed my arms. "Because their son was called out for bullying? Because they think you humiliated him in front of the whole school?" I let out a short laugh. "That's ridiculous." Holloway didn't smile. "It doesn't matter if it's ridiculous. It matters that they're upset. Carter's dad has been on the phone with the superintendent all morning." There it was. The real issue. The Carters were the kind of family that had their names on plaques in the gym, the kind that donated to the football program and had the superintendent's number saved in their phones. "So, what?" I asked, feeling my frustration bubble up. "I'm supposed to apologize for stepping in when a student was being harassed?" Holloway's jaw tensed. "I'm telling you to be careful. That's not the same thing." "No," he admitted, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's not." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he leaned forward, his voice quieter. "Look, Thompson, I know you mean well. But this is Texas. People don't like feeling like they're being told they're wrong, especially not by a teacher. So, what do I do? Ignore it when a kid gets bullied?" He sighed. "No. But you don't make a scene about it." I stared at him. "That's your advice? Keep quiet." His eyes met mine. "It's the advice that'll keep you in this job." I clenched my jaw. I wanted to argue, to tell him that protecting students wasn't supposed to be political, but I could see the exhaustion in his face. He wasn't telling me this because he agreed with the Carters. He was telling me because he knew how this town worked. And that was almost worse. Holloway sat back, rubbing his temples. "Look, just keep your head down for a while. Don't push this any further." I nodded, but I didn't mean it. I wasn't done. Not even close. The first Real hit came that Friday. I was stacking quizzes on my desk when I heard the rustling at my door. I glanced up and saw a folded piece of paper sliding across the tile. My stomach tightened as I picked it up. The handwriting was messy, hurried. "Traitor." That was it. One word, written in thick black marker. I exhaled slowly, pressing my thumb against the paper's edge. It shouldn't have bothered me. I'd been teaching long enough to know kids did stupid things. But this wasn't just kids. I walked to the door and looked into the hallway, but whoever had left it was already gone. By lunchtime, I got my second warning. I was in line for coffee when Susan Palmer, one of the newer teachers, touched my arm. "Hey," she said, lowering her voice. "You should probably know. People are talking." I gave a dry chuckle. "Yeah, I picked up on that." She hesitated. "No, I mean, they're talking. Parents. Other teachers. I overheard Daniels saying you were pushing an agenda. And some of the PTA moms? They're throwing around words like un-American." I let out a slow breath, my fingers tightening around my cup. "Un-American," I repeated. "For stopping a kid from being bullied." Susan's mouth pressed into a thin line. "I don't agree with it. But this town," she shook her head. "You know how it is." I did. This was a town where football games were sacred, where the church parking lot was fuller than the mall, where people whispered about outsiders even if they smiled to their faces. I'd lived here long enough to understand the undercurrents. But knowing didn't make it easier. By the time school let out, the email was waiting for me. "Mr. Thompson, we have received multiple concerns from parents regarding your recent conduct. Please report to my office Monday morning to discuss the matter." No signature. I stared at the screen, the words burning into my brain. Concerns. About me. Not about the kid being harassed. I closed my laptop, jaw tight. I should have let it go. I didn't. Instead, I grabbed my keys and headed for the parking lot. Because there was one person I needed to check on. And I wasn't about to let Aisha Malik feel like she was standing alone. The drive to Aisha's house felt longer than it was. I hadn't planned on doing this. Teachers weren't supposed to get involved past school hours, not like this. But something about the way Aisha had looked at me in the hallway, like she knew nothing would change, like she'd stopped expecting it to, kept pressing on my chest. When I pulled up to the address listed in the school records, I hesitated. It was a modest brick house, the kind you'd find in any Texas suburb, but I could already imagine what people in town said about this family. Probably whispered about how they didn't belong, how they were different. I was still debating whether this was a terrible idea when the front door opened. A man, tall, bearded, with weary eyes, stepped onto the porch. He looked at my car, then at me, his expression unreadable. I got out, lifting a hand in a small wave. "Mr. Malik." His stance didn't change. "Yes. I'm Daniel Thompson. I teach at Lincoln High." His brows drew together. "Is Aisha okay?" "She's fine," I said quickly. I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling. "I wanted to check in. I know she's been dealing with some problems at school." For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, with a short nod, he stepped aside. "Come in." Inside, the house smelled like spices and something warm cooking in the kitchen. Aisha's mother, a woman with soft eyes and a firm posture, greeted me with a cautious expression. Aisha herself was sitting at the kitchen table, her head snapping up when she saw me. "Mr. Thompson." I gave her a small smile. "Hey, Aisha." She looked between me and her parents, clearly unsure of why I was here. I sat down across from her. "I just wanted to check on you." Her fingers tapped against the edge of the table. "You didn't have to do that." "Maybe not," I admitted. "But I wanted to." Her father took a seat, folding his arms. "What exactly is happening at school?" His voice was steady, but there was something beneath it. Not surprise. Resignation. Like he already knew. Aisha glanced at me, then sighed. "Same thing as always." Her mother inhaled sharply. "Again." I frowned. "This has happened before?" Aisha let out a small, humorless laugh. "Of course." Something in me twisted. How had I not seen it before? Her father leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "And what is the school doing?" I hesitated. I stepped in when I saw it. "But there's been pushback." His jaw clenched. "Pushback?" Aisha's mother shook her head. "We've lived here for years. We try to keep our heads down. But this town," she exhaled, "they don't want us to belong." Aisha looked away, staring at the table. The weight of it settled in my chest. I'd always known small towns had their unspoken rules. But this was more than that. This was a pattern. One that had been ignored for too long. And I was done ignoring it. I met Mr. Malik's eyes. "I'm not going to let this go." Aisha gave me a skeptical look. "You don't have to do this." "Yes," I said, my voice firm. "I do. Because if I let this slide, I was no better than the rest of them." Monday morning, I walked into Principal Holloway's office, ready for a fight. He was already sitting at his desk, fingers steepled, looking like a man who'd been dealing with complaints all weekend. The blinds were half closed, casting striped shadows across the room. "Shut the door," he said. I did. He let out a slow breath, then motioned to the chair across from him. "Sit." I didn't. "Thompson," he said, rubbing his temples, "do you have any idea the kind of storm you've kicked up?" I crossed my arms. "I stepped in when a student was being harassed. That's my job." He shook his head. "Your job is to teach, not to pick fights with half the parents in this town." I scoffed. "That's what they're calling it. A fight." He tapped a stack of papers on his desk. "You want to know what these are?" I didn't answer. "Complaints," he said. "Emails. Voicemails. Parents saying you're forcing politics into the classroom. That you're undermining traditional values. He exhaled sharply. Hell, some are even calling for your resignation. A flicker of something cold ran through me. Not fear. Not yet. But something close. I squared my shoulders. So, what happens now? He leaned back, watching me. That depends. On what? His lips pressed into a thin line. On how much you're willing to push this. I stared at him. You want me to back down? I want you to be smart, he corrected. I want you to understand what you're up against. The Carters, the PTA, the school board, they don't want change. They want quiet. And if you keep making noise, they'll come after you. I didn't look away. And you? He hesitated. Just for a second. But I caught it. I can only protect you so much, he said finally. I clenched my jaw. That was it, then. The line had been drawn. I could step back, let it blow over. Or I could push forward, knowing full well what it might cost me. I already knew my answer. I'm not staying quiet, I said. Holloway sighed, rubbing his temples again. Then you better be ready for what comes next. I turned and walked out. What came next hit faster than I expected. By midweek, a rumor was circling that I was promoting anti-American values in my classroom. Another claimed I was pushing some kind of radical agenda. It was absurd. It was infuriating. But worst of all, it was working. A few of my students started acting differently. Some of the football players wouldn't look me in the eye. A couple of parents pulled their kids from my class. The whispers in the hallways got louder. But the real blow came Friday morning. I was setting up for first period when my phone buzzed. A message from my wife. Call me. I stepped into the hallway, dialing her number. She picked up on the first ring. Daniel, she said, her voice tight. It's Emma. My stomach dropped. What happened? She was crying when I dropped her off. She wouldn't tell me at first, but then she said some kids were making fun of her. I felt my grip tighten around the phone. What do you mean, making fun of her? A pause. Then, quietly, they were calling her a freak. A cold, sinking feeling spread through me. Emma was 9. Smart. And different. She had always been a little quieter, a little more creative. She liked science more than dolls, books more than sports. And apparently, that was enough to make her a target. I leaned against the wall, my chest tight. Who was it? I asked. She wouldn't say. I shut my eyes. I had spent the last week fighting for Aisha, trying to make people see what was happening to her. But I hadn't expected to come home to the same battle. And now I understood. Not in the way I had before. Not in the way you understand something from the outside, as an observer. I understood it as a father. I took a slow breath. This ends now, I said. And this time, I wasn't just fighting for Aisha. I was fighting for my own daughter, too. If this story resonated with you, share it with those who need to hear it. Let's start conversations that matter and that will lead to change. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what we are capable of when we stand up for what is right.